The studio lights glowed warmly across the set, giving everything a soft shine that made the place feel alive even before the cameras started rolling. Crew members hurried around with headsets and clipboards, adjusting the last pieces of equipment and straightening chairs on the stage. The audience slowly filled the seats, buzzing with excitement as whispers traveled from one person to another. Everyone knew it was going to be a special episode. Two legendary actors icons who shaped generations of cinema were appearing together. Even the most seasoned members of the production team felt something different in the air. Clint walked onto the set with the same calm confidence people had seen in him for decades. There was nothing loud about him. He didn't move fast or try to draw attention. He simply carried a quiet strength that made people naturally look his way. His steps were steady, and he nodded politely to everyone who greeted him. The crew respected him, not only for his long career, but for the simple manner in which he treated everyone equally. To him, a person holding a camera and a person holding a script were equally important. On the other side of the stage, the producers were welcoming Robert as he arrived. He moved with sharp energy, full of expression and life. He didn't try to hide what he felt, and maybe that was what made him so admired. People often said that he brought his whole heart into every role he ever played, and it seemed he lived everyday life the same way. Even while greeting the staff, he spoke with animated gestures, laughing, thinking, reacting. His presence filled the space as strongly as Clint's, but in a completely different way. Both men had aged, but time had only given them more character. Their faces carried the stories of decades in the industry, some filled with triumph, others with disappointment, and many with lessons no classroom could ever teach. They were different, but both carried the weight of experience on their shoulders. The co-hosts of the show gathered backstage, whispering excitedly. They had met many stars before, but these two had a special place in Hollywood's history. The idea of bringing them together on live television felt like a rare chance, maybe even a once-in-a-lifetime moment. They hoped for warm conversations, childhood stories, and insights about filmmaking. None of them imagined tension. None of them expected conflict. They simply believed that two great professionals would sit down, smile, and talk. The doors opened, and a stage manager held up a hand to signal that the live audience should quiet down. Instantly, the crowd softened into silence. The bright applause sign flashed, and the room erupted as music played through the speakers. The show had begun. The co-hosts took their seats, greeting viewers with cheerful voices, but their eyes were already drawn toward the two men waiting offstage. Clint stepped forward first. The applause grew louder, and he acknowledged the crowd with a small, humble wave. He didn't try to make a grand entrance. He didn't have to. His presence alone carried enough power, and Robert walked out. The audience reacted just as strongly. Some stood up to clap. Others shouted his name. He smiled as he waved, soaking in the moment without letting it go to his head. Both men shook hands with the hosts and finally took their seats. Cameras shifted and zoomed in as millions at home watched through their screens. At first, everything felt friendly and smooth. The hosts asked about their early careers, how they started, what roles shaped them, what memories they carried from the early days in Hollywood. Clint spoke in short, thoughtful sentences. His voice was steady, almost quiet, but every word felt meaningful. He didn't waste energy on anything unnecessary. When he talked about the past, he did it with calm admiration, as though he appreciated the journey without needing to dramatize it. Robert's answers were livelier, filled with expressive details and emotional layers. His hands moved as he talked, painting the scenes in the air. He described the rush of early auditions, the thrill of his first major role, the fear, the excitement, the uncertainty that came with being young and hungry in Hollywood. The audience laughed at some stories, and at other moments, they leaned forward, waiting to hear more. The contrast between the two was obvious, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Not yet. If anything, the difference added charm to the show. One host even joked about how the two seemed like opposite poles of a magnet, both powerful in their own way, but with completely different energies. They asked about their experiences directing. Clint explained how he preferred simple, straightforward sets. He believed in letting actors work naturally, without overwhelming them with instructions. He spoke about respecting time, respecting people, and getting things done efficiently. Robert talked about the emotional depth required for strong scenes. He believed in rehearsals, in digging deep, in understanding characters to their core. To him, filmmaking wasn't only about images, it was about human truth. The audience loved hearing them speak, but something subtle began to form under the surface. The more the conversation went on, the clearer it became that their ideas about filmmaking were not just different, they were almost opposite philosophies. Clint looked toward Robert with polite interest whenever he spoke. But every now and then, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in careful thought. Robert, on the other hand, reacted with strong expressions to some of Clint's comments. When Clint mentioned the importance of self-discipline and avoiding unnecessary drama, Robert tilted his head a little, blinking as if he didn't completely agree. Still, everything remained calm. Neither man challenged the other. They simply shared their views as professionals who had built their careers in different times and in different ways. But the audience could sense something unusual. It wasn't hostility. It was tension. The kind that forms when strong personalities with long histories step into the same space. It was the kind of tension that doesn't explode instantly, but slowly grows, waiting for the one question that might tip the balance. Backstage, a producer noticed it too. She leaned toward another team member and whispered, "They're not fighting. They're just very different." The other nodded. "Yeah, but if the wrong topic comes up, this could get interesting." They didn't mean it negatively. They simply understood that passion sometimes sparks friction. One of the co-hosts changed the topic to something lighter: early inspirations, mentors, and lessons learned over the years. Clint talked about how much he respected hardworking crews. He mentioned that the backbone of any film wasn't the star standing in front of the camera, but the dozens of people behind it, the sound team, the grips, the makeup artists, the editors, the production assistants running around trying to keep everything together. Robert nodded vigorously, adding that every film was a family built on trust. For a moment, the tension faded. The two legends even smiled at each other, finding common ground and shared respect for the craft. The hosts also asked about memorable moments on set. Clint shared a story about a long day of filming in extreme weather and how the entire team stayed patient and committed. His storytelling was quiet but powerful, and the audience listened closely. Robert shared a story about a spontaneous moment during one of his films that turned into one of the most emotional scenes of his career. The room filled with laughter and appreciation. Everything flowed smoothly again. The show felt warm, relaxed, and natural. Nobody could have guessed that this calm beginning was only the surface, and that the real spark had not yet arrived. But the producers, sitting behind their monitors, could feel the undercurrent shifting once more. One of them whispered, "It's building again." The other sighed softly, "Yeah, all it takes is one strong opinion." But for now, the conversation remained steady. The audience enjoyed the rare view of two legends sharing a stage, reflecting on their journeys and opening up with honesty. They admired how differently they carried themselves, one quiet and steady, the other expressive and full of fire. The co-hosts continued their questions, guiding the show gently. The actors responded with sincerity, offering stories, advice, and little moments that seemed to bring viewers closer to them. No shouting, no irritation, No clash, just two professionals talking. Yet something subtle lingered in their eyes. Respect was there, but so was the clear awareness that they stood on two sides of a wide creative line. And even though the show began smoothly, instincts told everyone present that the calm would not last forever. The first spark had not yet struck, but the atmosphere was already shifting just enough for everyone to notice. For now, though, the show remained warm, steady, and controlled like the quiet before a storm that nobody fully understands until the wind finally changes. The calm atmosphere in the studio didn't last long after the first break. As the crew walked around adjusting microphones and checking camera angles, something in the air felt different. It wasn't heavy or alarming, but it carried a gentle tension, the kind that forms when two strong personalities quietly weigh each other's words. Even though both actors had spoken respectfully so far, their differences had begun to settle deeper in the conversation, waiting for the moment when they would resurface. When the cameras switched on again, the hosts welcomed viewers back with cheerful voices. Unaware of how the mood between the two guests had shifted, the audience clapped and settled in their seats, eager for more stories, more insights, more of the rare opportunity to see two legends sharing the same stage. The next segment began with questions about the evolution of Hollywood. It seemed harmless enough. Many stars had answered similar questions over the years, and usually, the answers brought nostalgic laughter and reflections about how the industry had changed with time. One of the hosts turned toward Clint and asked, "Do you think the industry is better or worse today than when you started?" Clint rested his elbows gently on the armrests and gave a small, thoughtful nod. His eyes held the same patient calm they always had. "I think every generation has its own challenges," he replied. "When I started, everything was different. How films were made, how actors were trained, how sets worked. But the core of filmmaking hasn't changed. You show up, you work hard, and you tell a good story. Discipline still matters. Respect still matters." His tone was simple, not critical, not harsh. He spoke with a quiet firmness that came from years of experience. The host nodded and turned to Robert. "What about you? Do you agree?" Robert leaned back slightly, his hands already moving as he prepared to answer. "I think the industry has changed a lot," he said with strong emotion behind his words. "And yes, discipline is important. Of course it is. But artists also need the freedom to speak, to express, to be bold. Times have changed. People expect stories that reflect the world we live in, stories that mean something." The audience nodded, appreciating his passion. Robert always spoke as if every word mattered, and people admired that energy. Clint listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When Robert mentioned freedom to express, Clint's brow lifted ever so slightly, just enough for viewers who paid close attention to notice. The host sensed a difference in their viewpoints and gently asked, "So you both have different ways of looking at it?" Clint didn't hesitate. "Different, yes. But that's all right. Not everyone will see things the same way." Robert gave a short laugh, not mocking, just surprised. "That's true. But sometimes you have to push for your message. Sometimes you have to speak up." Clint's voice remained level, as long as it doesn't turn into unnecessary noise. The studio fell quieter. It wasn't an insult, but it was a firm statement. Robert blinked, sitting forward a bit. "Noise?" Clint nodded once. "There's a difference between making a point and making a scene." It wasn't meant as a jab, but the words carried weight. The crew members behind the cameras exchanged quick glances. The hosts felt the shift to the sudden stillness. The slight tension in the air. The audience leaned in, most of them unaware that they were witnessing the beginning of something that would soon grow bigger. Robert gave a slow exhale. He wasn't angry yet, but his frustration showed in the way his jaw tightened. Sometimes a scene is exactly what wakes people up, he said. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't move sharply. He simply replied, "Sometimes it distracts from the work." The host quickly stepped in, smiling nervously. "Let's talk about something else, maybe something lighter," she said. But the energy on stage had already changed, even if the conversation moved on. Still, the show had to continue. So the hosts shifted the topic to favorite memories from award ceremonies. They asked about funny backstage moments, wardrobe mishaps, and unexpected encounters. Robert jumped into the stories with enthusiasm, sharing humorous events with vivid details. He had a talent for storytelling that made people laugh without trying too hard. Clint listened, smiling politely as he added one or two quiet memories of his own, short, simple, but meaningful. The audience enjoyed the balance between them, one expressive and full of life, the other calm and steady, like a seasoned storyteller who knew exactly what to say and what to leave unspoken. But under their polite smiles, the earlier disagreement lingered like an uninvited guest. One of the hosts eventually asked a question that gently stirred that tension again. "Do you two think Hollywood today focuses more on personal expression or traditional discipline?" It was meant to be a balanced question, but everyone knew who would take which side. Clint answered first. "There's nothing wrong with expression," he said. "But people confuse expression with chaos. Film sets need order. They need respect. You can't create something meaningful if everyone is too busy arguing or trying to make everything about themselves." Robert shifted in his seat. His expression stayed calm, but the spark in his eyes returned. "And you can't create something meaningful if people are afraid to speak their truth," he said. "Art is messy sometimes. It's not always controlled." Clint looked at him with the quiet intensity he was known for. "Messy isn't the same thing as meaningful," he replied. For a moment, the entire room went silent. It wasn't a dramatic silence. It was the kind of silence that naturally falls when two experienced people meet at a crossroads of belief. The hosts exchanged quick glances, unsure if they should cut to commercial or let the conversation continue. But neither actor raised their voice. Neither insulted the other. They simply held two different truths. The producers backstage leaned closer to the monitors. "It's starting," one said softly. "And it's still calm," another replied. "But look at them. This could go either way." The show carried on, but the tone had changed. The audience was no longer listening just for entertainment. Now they were observing, paying attention to every small expression, every pause, every glance. The next question came from another host who tried to lighten the mood again. "What advice would you give young actors today?" she asked. Clint answered with quiet confidence. "Show up on time. Know your lines. Respect the people around you. And don't depend on drama to get attention. Focus on the craft. Let your work speak for you." The audience nodded. It sounded like the voice of someone who had lived long enough to see everything and had no need for noise. Robert waited until Clint finished before giving his own advice. "Be brave," he said. "Don't let fear silence you. If you believe in something, don't be afraid to stand up for it. Acting isn't just about performing. It's about truth. And truth sometimes needs a strong voice." The audience applauded again, though the applause felt divided, as though different groups agreed with different philosophies. Both pieces of advice were reasonable. Both were sincere. But both revealed exactly how far apart the two men stood. Moments passed, filled with polite conversation and controlled smiles. But everyone in the room sensed that the real conversation, the deeper one, was only just beginning. The hosts noticed the rising tension and tried their best to keep the atmosphere warm. They laughed a little louder, smiled a little wider, and asked lighter questions. But strong personalities don't hide forever. especially when their beliefs run deep. A co-host shifted uncomfortably before asking the next question, hoping it might bring balance. Do you both think the audience today expects different things than before? Clint answered simply, audiences want honesty, and they want stories that feel grounded. Not everything needs to be a fight or a message. Sometimes a story is just a story. Robert leaned forward. People also want stories that reflect the world. They want meaning, depth, emotion. Sometimes that requires strong opinions. Clint gave the smallest nod. Strong opinions are fine as long as they don't take over the work. Robert inhaled slowly. But sometimes the work is the opinion. Again, silence not uncomfortable. Just charged. The show continued, but the audience could feel something shifting. The tension wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet in the way a storm begins far away. Just a soft rumble you feel before you hear. The hosts wrapped up the segment and cut to another break. The moment the cameras turned off, the two men relaxed slightly, but they didn't look at each other. Clint stared calmly at his hands. Robert leaned back and took a deep breath. Crew members stepped in, adjusting microphones and giving quick reminders about the next segment. But even they moved more carefully now, aware that something delicate was unfolding. The energy between the two actors wasn't hostile. It wasn't explosive. It was something else, two worlds quietly touching, each refusing to bend, and everyone watching, both in the studio and at home, could tell that the calm that followed was only temporary. The real friction hadn't happened yet, but it was coming, and when it arrived, it would not be something the hosts or the audience would forget easily. When the show returned from the break, something in the air had changed. The audience didn't know exactly what had happened behind the scenes, but they could sense the shift the moment the lights came back on. The two actors sat in their chairs, both calm on the surface, yet carrying the quiet weight of the earlier disagreement. Their faces were composed, their voices steady, but their eyes held more than simple politeness. The host smiled brightly, as if nothing unusual had happened, hoping to guide the conversation back into smoother waters. But strong personalities rarely let tension disappear so easily. It simply waited, settling silently between them like a thin layer of fog. The next segment began with a question that was meant to be simple. One of the co-hosts leaned forward and asked, "In your opinion, what keeps an actor grounded in this industry?" It was an innocent question. At least that was the intention. Clint answered first. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with the same care he had shown throughout his life. Humility, he said. You stay grounded by remembering where you came from. You don't let fame or attention get into your head. You work hard, you stay respectful, and you avoid unnecessary drama. If you stay focused on the work, everything else falls into place. The audience nodded. His tone carried the wisdom of someone who had walked long roads and survived many storms. The host then turned to Robert. "What about you?" she asked. Robert took a short breath before answering. "To me, staying grounded means staying true to your voice," he said. "You can't pretend to be someone you're not just because people expect you to act a certain way. You speak up when something matters. You don't hide behind silence. You don't let fear shrink you." The audience reacted with soft applause. His passion was clear, and people admired the sincerity behind it. But Clint's expression hardened just a little, barely enough to notice, but enough to shift the air. Robert continued, unaware of the effect his words were having. "Too many people stay quiet because they don't want conflict," he added. "But silence doesn't fix anything. Sometimes you have to speak out." Clint finally looked up, his eyes steady. "There's speaking out," he replied, "and then there's turning everything into a stage." The studio fell quiet. Even the hosts froze for a moment. Robert turned toward him. "What's that supposed to mean?" Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. He simply said, "It means not every topic needs a spotlight. Some things are better handled without turning them into a performance." The tension that had been building finally surfaced. Robert gave a short, tense laugh, the kind that wasn't truly amused. "So you're saying speaking up is a performance?" he asked. Clint remained calm. "I'm saying intention matters," he said. "If the goal is to help, then help. If the goal is attention, then it becomes noise." Robert sat up straighter. "You think I do things for attention?" Clint held his gaze. "I think some people forget the difference between expression and disruption." The room felt colder now, as if every light above them had dimmed just slightly. One of the co-hosts quickly intervened. Let's shift the topic a little," she said with a nervous smile. "Let's talk about your most challenging roles." But the shift didn't fully land. The two actors continued to watch each other, their expressions calm but sharp, like two people standing at the edge of a conversation neither wanted to start, but neither was willing to avoid. Still, professionalism forced them forward. Robert answered the next question first. He talked about a role that demanded deep emotional work, describing the long nights and the complicated feelings he had to explore. His voice softened with vulnerability, and the audience listened with empathy. Clint responded with a different kind of story, one about physical endurance and working under harsh conditions. His tone was steady, his message straightforward, but even as the audience appreciated their experiences, everyone could sense the shift beneath their words. Something inside Robert hadn't settled from the earlier exchange. And something inside Clint refused to back down from what he believed. The hosts tried again to warm the atmosphere. "Both of you have such different approaches," one said with a gentle laugh. "Do you ever admire something about the other's method?" It was meant to soften the mood. Robert nodded. "Of course," he said. "I respect his discipline, his ability to stay focused." "I admire that." Clint nodded back. "And I respect his dedication to emotion," he said. "He commits fully. That takes courage." For a moment, the audience relaxed, but the peace lasted only briefly. The host then asked a question she didn't realize would tip the balance entirely. "Do you think actors today face more pressure to take public positions on issues?" she asked. Clint's jaw tightened slightly. Robert took a slow breath. The host smiled, waiting for their responses. Clint answered first. "People face pressure to speak without thinking," he said. "Not every issue needs a public declaration from an actor. Sometimes the most responsible thing is to stay quiet unless you understand what you're talking about." Robert's eyes widened, just enough to show he disagreed. Clint continued, "Unaware or unconcerned about the reaction. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's respect. Sometimes it's wisdom." Robert leaned forward. "And sometimes silence helps the wrong things continue," he said, his voice firmer now. "Silence can be dangerous too. People look up to us. They expect honesty. They expect bravery." Clint didn't react for a long moment. Then he said, "Honesty is good, but shouting doesn't make something more honest." That was it. That was the moment the calm broke. Robert shook his head slowly. "You think speaking up is shouting?" Clint said nothing. Robert's voice lowered. "You think having strong beliefs is noise?" Still, Clint didn't answer. The silence itself became an answer. One of the hosts tried again to lighten the mood, her voice slightly shaky. "Let's talk about behind-the-scenes memories, funny moments. Surely you both have many." But the energy had shifted too far. Robert adjusted his jacket, exhaling sharply. "You know," he said, "I'm not against quiet. I'm not against restraint. But there's a difference between being reserved and being dismissive." Clint finally spoke again. "And there's a difference between being passionate and being loud." The room fell silent again. The audience didn't breathe. The hosts stared at their cards. Unsure what to do next, a small voice inside the producer's booth whispered, "Should we cut to commercial?" Another voice answered, "Not yet. Let's see where this goes." But the tension didn't explode into yelling. That wasn't who these men were. They weren't reckless or uncontrolled. Their disagreement was deeper than anger. It was built from decades of belief, experience, and the ways the world had shaped them. Every sentence now felt heavy. Every pause, every breath mattered. Finally, a co-host asked gently, "Is there something either of you would like to clarify?" Robert looked at Clint. "I respect your experience," he said slowly, "but you have to understand something. Some of us grew up believing that staying silent was the worst thing we could do." Clint listened. Robert continued, "Sometimes speaking up is the only way some people feel seen, the only way they feel heard. If we, as actors with influence, don't speak when it matters, then who will?" Clint took a slow breath. "I understand that," he said. "But speaking without enough understanding can hurt more than help. Words matter. They carry weight. And once they're out there, you can't take them back." Robert nodded. "That's true. But silence carries weight too." For a moment, neither said anything. It wasn't anger now. It was something else. Two men finally admitting that their experiences had shaped different truths. The host sensed the moment softening, just slightly. They guided the conversation back into safer topics. They asked about life outside of acting, about childhood memories, about small things that made them smile. Clint talked about long mornings on quiet ranches, places where the world felt simple and grounded. Robert talked about growing up in a busy neighborhood filled with noise, music, and people who spoke their minds. And suddenly, everything made sense. Their differences didn't begin on that stage. They began in the lives they had lived. Clint had learned calm, discipline, and restraint. Robert had learned expression, courage, and voice. Two people shaped by two different worlds. The audience listened, their expressions softening. The hosts nodded slowly as understanding filled the room. But beneath the calm, the earlier spark still lingered, waiting for the next moment, the moment when their beliefs would crash again. Because deep down, everyone knew the clash wasn't finished. The real conflict was coming. It was only a matter of time. The tension from the show lingered in the air long after the cameras stopped rolling. Even though the studio lights slowly dimmed and the crew members returned to their usual routines, there was still a sense that something heavy had happened, something people would keep talking about for a long time. As the audience cleared out, Clint stayed behind for a few minutes, wanting to make sure the situation didn't escalate any further. His calm nature had always been his strength, but he also knew when to take a stand. And earlier that day, he had done exactly that. Robert had already left the stage, walking briskly backstage with a few staff members trying to keep up with him. He didn't speak much, only nodding stiffly as someone asked if he needed water. His expression stayed tight and unreadable, and even though he tried to hide it, it was clear the clash with Clint had shaken him. Robert wasn't someone who backed down easily, but he wasn't used to situations spiraling so publicly either. Clint eventually stepped off the stage, moving toward the hallway that connected to the dressing rooms. He didn't rush, and he didn't look upset. In fact, his face carried that same quiet focus he had held throughout the whole incident. People stepped aside as he walked past, some whispering, others simply watching him. He wasn't angry, just thoughtful. It bothered him when conversations turned into shouting, especially when both people involved were old enough to know better. But he also understood people sometimes reacted emotionally when they cared deeply about something. One of the producers approached Clint with a hesitant smile, unsure how he might respond after everything that happened. "Thank you for staying calm back there," she said carefully. "That could have gotten a lot worse." Clint gave her a small, tired smile. People get heated. It happens, he replied. But sometimes you have to know when to stop before it turns into something none of us can walk back from. The producer nodded, relieved by his steady tone. We appreciate how you handled it. The hosts. Well, they didn't expect things to go in that direction. They rarely do, Clint said with a quiet chuckle. Television is unpredictable. He continued down the hallway, and while the producer went back toward the stage, Clint made his way to his dressing room. He wanted just a moment of quiet to gather his thoughts before facing any interviews or statements. But when he reached the door, he found someone already standing there, one of the young crew members, who had been helping throughout the day. She looked nervous, as if she wasn't sure whether she should say something or walk away. When she noticed Clint approaching, she straightened up, clutching a clipboard to her chest. Sir, I just wanted to say you handled that really well, she said shyly. A lot of people would have yelled back or made things worse. Clint smiled kindly. Thank you. But sometimes it's better to listen more than you speak. That's something you learn after a while. The crew member nodded quickly, clearly grateful he didn't brush her off. Well, I hope your day gets better from here. It will, he answered gently. You take care. When the young woman walked away, Clint stepped inside the dressing room and closed the door behind him. The room was quiet, lit softly by a few warm bulbs around the mirror. He took a deep breath and sat down, letting the silence settle. The clash with Robert replayed in his mind, but not in a dramatic way, more like a moment he wanted to understand fully. Clint didn't enjoy public arguments. He believed in speaking firmly, but respectfully. Earlier, when Robert's tone had risen and the tension had spiked, Clint hadn't stepped in to embarrass him. He stepped in because he felt the conversation was turning unfair, and silence would have meant agreeing with something he didn't actually agree with. Still, Clint had no desire to hold a grudge. After a few minutes, there was a knock on the door. Clint stood up and opened it, expecting maybe a producer or assistant. Instead, he found one of the show hosts standing there, looking apologetic. Clint, can I come in for a second? She asked softly. Of course, he replied, stepping aside. She entered, closing the door behind her. Her expression showed embarrassment, maybe even guilt. Clint could already tell she wasn't there for small talk. I just wanted to say I'm sorry about what happened, she began. We didn't expect Robert to react that way. We thought it would just be a normal discussion piece. Clint shook his head, his tone gentle. You don't need to apologize. These things happen. Everyone has their own way of expressing something they care about. She sighed with relief, but still looked troubled. I just feel like the show didn't handle it well. You deserved better than to be caught in the middle of that. Clint gave a slow nod. Maybe, but I'm not upset. I'm more concerned about Robert. He seemed overwhelmed. He was, she admitted. He left quickly. I think he just needs time to cool off. Clint leaned back against the counter, folding his arms. We've known each other for years. It's not the first disagreement we've had. But this one played out in front of a crowd, and that makes everything feel louder. The host nodded thoughtfully, appreciating his calm perspective. Do you think he'll reach out? She asked. Eventually, Clint answered with certainty. He's stubborn, but he's not unreasonable. Give him a day or two. They spoke for another minute before she thanked him again and left. Clint sat down once more, taking a deep breath as he thought about everything. He didn't like how dramatic things had become, but drama was part of the world they worked in, whether they liked it or not. Meanwhile, Robert sat alone in his own dressing room on the opposite side of the hallway. A bottle of water sat untouched on the small table beside him. He stared at the floor, replaying the argument in his mind, feeling frustration mixed with embarrassment. He hadn't meant for things to go that far. The last thing he wanted was to look like he was losing control on national television. A staff member knocked lightly and stepped in, offering him a quick update on the rest of the show's schedule. Robert nodded silently, barely listening. His thoughts were somewhere else back on stage, remembering Clint's steady voice and calm demeanor. It wasn't Clint he was upset with. It was himself. As the day went on, news of the clash spread quickly across social media. Clips circulated online, drawing thousands of comments. Some people supported Clint's calmness. Others sympathized with Robert, saying he had every right to feel strongly. But everyone agreed on one thing. It had been a moment no one expected. Clint's team eventually knocked on his door, letting him know they were ready to leave. He gathered his things, thanked the staff, and walked out of the building into the cool afternoon air. The sky was clear, and a light breeze brushed across his face. He took another deep breath, grateful the long day was finally ending. But as he walked toward his car, he sensed that this moment was only one part of a larger story still unfolding. Whatever came next, whether it was a conversation, an apology, or simply time healing the tension, they would have to face it one step at a time. And for now, that was enough. The next morning arrived quietly, but the world outside was anything but calm. News outlets had already grabbed the story from the show, and social media continued to buzz nonstop. People argued back and forth, taking sides without really understanding what had happened beyond the few minutes of footage they had seen. Clint and Robert were trending everywhere, and it felt like the entire world had turned the moment into something much bigger than either of them intended. Clint woke early, as he always did. He preferred mornings, calm, slow, and far from the noise of the public eye. He made himself a simple breakfast and sat by the window, watching the sunrise. There was something grounding about the way the light crept across the sky, unaffected by human arguments or public debates. The world moved on, even when people didn't. His phone buzzed several times, but he let it ring. He knew the calls were probably from reporters, producers, or people wanting comments. He wasn't interested in giving statements. As far as he was concerned, nothing good ever came from adding fuel to a fire already burning. After a while, he finally checked one message from an old friend who had watched the show. It simply read, "You handled yourself well. Don't let the noise bother you." Clint smiled, appreciating the quiet support. Across the city, Robert's morning looked very different. He woke after barely sleeping, his thoughts racing from the moment he opened his eyes. He had always been passionate, always spoken his mind, but he wasn't proud of how things had gone. The argument replayed in his head over and over, and each time he wished he had handled it differently. He poured himself a cup of coffee, but even that didn't settle him. His phone buzzed constantly, 2 texts, missed calls, notifications. Unlike Clint, he checked them. He scrolled through the comments, the reactions, the headlines. Some defended him, saying he was standing up for his beliefs. Others said he acted unfairly, claiming Clint had shown more maturity. Robert sighed heavily. He wasn't angry with Clint, not at all. But pride had a way of locking his words inside him, refusing to let them out even when he wanted to apologize. By mid-morning, both men had begun receiving calls from the show's producers. Clint ignored the first 2, but eventually answered the third. He greeted them politely, listening quietly as they explained the situation. They wanted to clear things up publicly. They wanted both men to join a follow-up segment to calm the public reaction. Clint understood their reasons. It wasn't unusual for television shows to try to manage damage, but he wasn't convinced it was necessary. "I appreciate the call," Clint said in his steady voice, "but I don't think adding more noise is going to help. Sometimes it's better to let things settle on their own." The producer hesitated, clearly hoping for a different answer. "We just think people might feel more at ease if they saw the 2 of you in a better light." Clint sighed softly. "Let me think about it. I'll call back." Meanwhile, Robert had a very different response. When the producers reached him, he was still pacing his living room. "We'd like to invite you and Clint back for a short segment," they said. "Just something calm, nothing heavy." Robert rubbed his forehead. "Let me guess. You want us to smile for the camera and pretend none of it happened?" "No," the producer said carefully. "We want you two to show people that disagreements don't have to end in resentment." Robert didn't answer right away. He didn't want to fake anything. But he also didn't want people thinking he enjoyed conflict. "I'll think about it," he finally said. Once he hung up, he sat on his couch and stared at his hands. He remembered the look on Clint's face during the argument. Not angry, not mocking, just steady. Clint had spoken with a calm that Robert admired but struggled to match. After an hour of thinking, Robert did something he usually avoided. He reached for his phone to call Clint. Clint had been reading quietly when he saw Robert's name flash on the screen. He didn't hesitate. He answered with a simple, "Hello." There was silence for a moment on the other end. Then Robert's voice came through, a little rough but sincere. "Clint, I wanted to say I didn't handle things well yesterday." Clint took a breath, not rushing to fill the silence. "I appreciate you calling. I wasn't angry at you," Robert continued. "I just let the topic get to me. I shouldn't have snapped like that." "You felt strongly," Clint replied. "Nothing wrong with that. We all care about things in our own way." Robert let out a soft, almost embarrassed laugh. "You're too understanding, you know that?" Clint smiled. "Someone has to be." The tension eased between them almost instantly. Neither of them liked grudges. Life was too short to hold on to small arguments. After a moment, Robert said, "The show wants us to go back. Do you want to do it?" Clint leaned back in his chair, thinking. "Only if you're comfortable with it. I don't see the point in forcing anything." "I'm not doing it for them," Robert said honestly. "I'm doing it because people think we're at each other's throats. I'd rather they know we're fine." Clint nodded, understanding the sentiment. "All right. If you want to do it, I'll join you." "Good," Robert said softly. "And thanks." After they hung up, Clint felt lighter. Not because the public would calm down, but because he knew the important thing was already settled. The friendship was intact. The producers were thrilled when both men agreed. They immediately began planning a short, respectful segment for the next afternoon. It wouldn't be dramatic, and it wouldn't be scripted. That was exactly how Clint insisted it should be. Before the segment, they both arrived at the studio separately. Clint walked in calmly, greeting the staff with the same gentle nods he always gave. Robert arrived a few minutes later. When he walked into the waiting area and saw Clint sitting there reading a newspaper, he paused. Clint looked up and smiled. "Morning," Robert chuckled. "You make it look like nothing ever bothers you." "That's not true," Clint said, folding the newspaper. "I just try not to show it unless it's helpful." Robert sat beside him, exhaling. "I'm glad you're here." The two talked quietly until the show staff came to bring them backstage. They weren't nervous, just thoughtful. They didn't want to put on a show. They wanted to speak honestly and move on. When they stepped onto the stage, the audience welcomed them with warm applause. It wasn't the loud, dramatic energy from the previous day. This time, the room felt calm. One of the hosts smiled gently and said, "Thank you both for coming back." A lot of people were worried yesterday's discussion meant something deeper. Clint spoke first. "We disagreed. It happens. We're both passionate people, but we don't have to walk away angry." Robert nodded. "I let my emotions get ahead of me, and I should have handled it better. But that's on me, not Clint." The room felt lighter instantly. The audience appreciated the honesty, and the hosts didn't push for drama. They allowed both men to speak in their own way. Clint added, "People don't have to agree all the time. What matters is respecting each other when we don't." Robert glanced at him with a small smile. He's right. We're fine. No drama behind the scenes. The segment ended gracefully, no tension, no lingering awkwardness. When they walked off stage together, the staff seemed relieved, as if a storm had passed. Outside, as they walked toward their cars, Robert slowed his steps. "Clint," he said quietly, "I'm glad we talked, and I appreciate how you handled everything." Clint rested a hand on his shoulder for a moment. "We'll always have different viewpoints. That's what makes conversations interesting. But respect should never fall away." Robert nodded, feeling the tension fully release for the first time since the argument. They said their goodbyes, each heading off in different directions, but both feeling the same sense of closure. The world might continue talking about the clash for a while. People loved stories, especially dramatic ones, but the truth was simple. They weren't enemies. They weren't rivals. They were two strong personalities who cared deeply about their beliefs, and sometimes passion spilled over. What mattered most was that they walked away with understanding instead of bitterness. And as the day settled, both men returned to their lives, knowing the important part of the story had already been resolved quietly, respectfully, and far from the cameras. The days that followed felt calmer, as if the world had finally stopped spinning around the argument that had once consumed every headline. After the follow-up segment aired, people slowly shifted their attention to other stories, leaving the clash between Clint and Robert as just another moment in a long list of unexpected television events. But for the two men involved, the experience didn't fade as quickly as the news cycle. It stayed with them, shaping their thoughts in quieter, more personal ways. Clint returned to his usual routine, spending his mornings reading, his afternoons working, and his evenings reflecting in quiet spaces. He didn't dwell on the argument. He simply considered what it had revealed, not just about the pressures of public life, but about the importance of calm voices in chaotic rooms. He believed deeply in listening, in taking time to understand the heart behind someone's words, even when their tone was strong or heated. It was a lesson he hoped others picked up from that moment. As for Robert, the experience had stirred something inside him. Not guilt exactly, but a sense of awareness. He had always been outspoken, always led with passion, but the argument had reminded him of the importance of balance, of passion held in one hand and patience in the other. He thought often about how easily small moments could explode when watched by millions. It made him appreciate the value of stepping back, breathing, and remembering that disagreement didn't have to become conflict. One afternoon, about a week after the segment, Clint received a message from Robert. It wasn't long, just a simple question. "Want to meet for lunch?" Clint smiled when he read it. He had known this day would come. They weren't the kind of men to let distance grow where friendship already existed. They agreed on a quiet little place far away from the cameras, a spot Clint often visited for its peaceful atmosphere. When Robert arrived, wearing a simple jacket and a thoughtful expression, Clint stood to greet him. They shook hands, and without needing to say anything, both felt the easy familiarity return. They sat by the window, ordered light meals, and really talked. Not about the show, not about the argument, not even about the public reaction. Instead, they spoke about life, family, work, the things that grounded them. It felt good, simple, human. At one point, Robert paused, looking out the window for a moment before turning back to Clint. "You know," he began quietly, "I've been thinking about that day a lot." Clint didn't interrupt. He simply listened. "I realized something," Robert said. "I've spent so many years trying to stand strong in everything I believe that sometimes I forget strength doesn't always look loud." Clint smiled gently. "Strength has many forms. Sometimes it whispers." Robert nodded. "Yeah, and sometimes it sits across from you and reminds you without saying it." Clint chuckled softly. "We learn as we go." That's all any of us can do. The conversation carried on, weaving between humor, memories, and quiet reflections. There was no tension, no lingering regret, only the comfortable understanding. That comes from two people who had walked through a storm and come out on the other side with clearer eyes. By the time they finished lunch, they both felt lighter. Not because the world had forgotten the argument, but because they knew they had handled it with honesty, dignity, and a shared desire for peace. Outside the restaurant, they paused by their cars, the afternoon sun warming the pavement beneath their feet. Robert looked at Clint and said, "I'm glad we didn't let that moment define anything." Clint nodded. "Moments only define us if we let them." They shook hands once more, and as Robert walked away, he felt a sense of calm he hadn't felt in days. Clint watched him go, grateful for the clarity the moment had brought. In the weeks that followed, both men moved forward with their lives and careers. But something had changed, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, meaningful one. They carried with them a stronger appreciation for openness, for understanding, for talking to each other instead of through headlines. The public eventually moved on completely. The clips stopped circulating, the debates ended, and the buzz faded. What remained was the real story, not the argument itself, but the way two people chose to handle it afterward. Not with bitterness or stubborn pride, but with honesty, respect, and willingness to listen. Months later, they found themselves at the same charity event. It wasn't planned. They had simply been invited by different people. When Clint spotted Robert across the room, he made his way through the small crowd. Robert saw him approaching and grinned. "Well," Robert said playfully, "look who came to steal the spotlight." Clint laughed. "Hardly. I just came to support a good cause." They stood together for a moment, watching the event unfold, the speeches, the music, the people dressed in their best clothes. It was a peaceful night, filled with hope rather than conflict. As they spoke to guests, took photos, and chatted with old acquaintances, anyone watching them would have seen two people comfortable in each other's presence, not rivals or opponents. And in truth, that was exactly what they were, two individuals with strong beliefs, who had learned something important about patience and understanding. Later in the evening, as they stepped aside for a moment of quiet, Robert turned to Clint. "You ever think about how fast things blow up online?" he asked. Clint smiled knowingly. "People love a storm, but storms pass. And what stays?" Robert asked. "The people who weather them together," Clint replied softly. Robert nodded, appreciating the simplicity and truth of the words. Toward the end of the night, the event organizers invited both men on stage to thank them for attending. The audience applauded warmly, recognizing the presence of two respected figures who had contributed decades of work to their industry. Clint spoke briefly, offering kind words about the charity and the importance of unity. When Robert spoke afterward, he glanced at Clint with a hint of humor and sincerity. "I guess I should keep things calm today," he joked lightly, earning gentle laughter from the crowd. Clint shook his head with a smile, and the room filled with warmth instead of tension. It felt like a perfect reminder of how far they had come. When the event ended and they walked out into the cool night air, Robert said, "I'll see you around." "Clint, you will," Clint replied. They parted ways once more, not as people who had clashed, but as people who had understood each other. As the night settled and the city lights shimmered against the sky, both men carried a quiet sense of gratitude, a reminder that disagreements didn't have to divide, and that respect could bridge even the loudest of moments. And in the end, the true story wasn't about an argument at all. It was about resolution. About humility. About two individuals choosing understanding over distance. It was a story about how even in a world full of noise, kindness and clarity could still be the strongest forces of all. He stayed quiet for a long time that morning, awake long before the sun touched the top of the hotel windows. The city sounded different at dawn, less proud, less loud, almost as if even the traffic understood that the night's arguments were still hanging in the air. After everything that had happened, he needed those quiet minutes. They gave him a chance to breathe, to sort through thoughts that had been pushed around by tension, pride, and confusion. He replayed every moment from the previous night in his mind, not because he wanted to, but because the memories kept rising on their own. The shouting, the unexpected anger, the way the air in the studio had felt thick enough to cut. He wondered if things could have gone differently. Maybe if he had paused before speaking. Maybe if he had chosen softer words. Maybe if the other man had, too. But thinking in circles never changed anything, and he knew better than to sit in regret for too long. Still, something inside him felt heavier than usual. Not guilt, because he hadn't meant any harm, but a kind of sadness that comes from seeing how quickly respect can crack when emotions run too high. He didn't want the world to think he enjoyed conflict. He didn't. But he also wasn't someone who backed down when he believed something needed to be said. By mid-morning, the messages started coming in. Producers, old friends, reporters, people he had worked with decades ago. Some were checking in, some wanted interviews, and others simply wanted to know if he was all right. He appreciated the concern, but part of him wished he could shut off every device and disappear into silence for a few days. Later, he stepped downstairs to the lobby to meet his driver. A few guests recognized him, though they didn't approach. They simply offered small nods, the kind that say, "We saw what happened. We hope you're okay." He nodded back. He respected quiet support more than dramatic reactions. As the car pulled away from the hotel, the streets passed in long rows of storefronts, billboards, and people rushing to whatever lives waited ahead of them. The world didn't pause for arguments, not even the ones everyone talked about. Life always kept moving, and he was grateful for that. The studio where he was headed had invited him weeks earlier. It wasn't connected to the show where the clash had happened. This place wanted him to talk about his latest project, something he had put a lot of heart into. The timing felt strange, giving interviews after a heated moment on live television, but commitments were commitments. And he wasn't one to cancel just because the spotlight felt a little too bright. When he stepped into the building, the staff greeted him with warm smiles. They didn't bring up the incident right away. They didn't laugh about it or whisper behind high.